She had been widowed 16 months and had not been paid in coin for 11 of them. What she had was flour, a good oven, and a reputation for bread that people crossed 2 streets for. What she did not have was money for a doctor, and the doctor was already on his way. The boy was 4 years old and had been running a fever since Tuesday. By Thursday morning, he had stopped asking for water, which was the thing that made her set her apron aside and walk to the pharmacy and ask Mrs. Larkin, in the quiet, steady voice of a woman who had used up her margin, whether Dr. Halloran might be willing to come. Mrs. Larkin looked at her face and said she would send the boy at once. She said nothing about the fee, which was its own kind of kindness, and Rebecca Wren walked home the long way so she would not have to pass the churchyard where her husband was buried under a stone she had not yet finished paying for. She had the fire built up by the time the doctor arrived. She had bread cooling on the shelf by the window because bread was what she did when there was nothing else to do, and there had been nothing else to do since Tuesday. He came in without knocking hard, only a single rap on the doorframe, and then he was inside, hanging his coat on the peg as though he had done it in this cabin before, which he had not. Thomas Halloran was 38 years old and had come west after a war that he did not speak of, and had set up a practice in a town that could not always pay him, and had made peace with that fact a long time ago. He was tall and lean in the way of a man who forgot to eat when the work was heavy, which was often. He carried a leather bag that had been mended twice at the handle, and he moved through the front room to the small bed in the corner without wasting a step. She stood back and let him work. He was quiet with the boy in the way a good doctor is quiet, no false cheer, no performance, only the careful hands and the low voice asking small questions the boy could answer by nodding. He listened to the chest with an ear trumpet older than he was. He touched the boy's forehead with the back of his hand, and then the palm, and then the back again. He asked when the fever had started and what he had eaten and whether he had complained of his ears. She answered plainly and did not embellish, and he noted her manner without comment. He was there 38 minutes. When he stood up from the bedside, the boy was already asleep in the loose, easy way of a child who has been ill and has just been touched by hands that knew what they were doing. Dr. Halloran turned from the bed, and Rebecca Wren was standing at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood in the way of a woman who has already decided not to apologize. He walked to the table and set the bag down and said the boy would be fine. It was the ear, he said. It had turned. He would leave a powder for the pain and another for the fever, and she was to give the powders in warm water every 4 hours through the night, and by morning the boy would be asking for bread. He said the word bread without meaning anything by it, and then he saw the loaves on the shelf and paused for half a breath and went on. He wrote out the instructions in a hand that was careful because he knew people sometimes had to have a neighbor read the paper to them. She watched him write. When he was done, he set the pencil down and looked up at her, and she did not look away, and the room was very quiet with the boy sleeping and the fire settling in the stove. "I can only pay you in bread," she said. She said it the way a person says a true thing that costs them. She said it looking at him. She did not lower her eyes, and she did not raise her chin higher than it already was. Her hands stayed flat on the table where he could see them. Dr. Halloran looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face did what faces do when they are deciding whether to say the easy thing or the true one. He chose the true one. "Bread will be fine," he said. He said it plainly, the way he had said everything else, and she understood that he was not being gallant and he was not being kind in the performative way that men were sometimes kind to widows. He was simply agreeing to a transaction. She wrapped 2 loaves in clean linen and set them on the table beside his bag. He looked at them and then at her and picked them up carefully with both hands as though they were something more delicate than bread. "I'll come back Thursday," he said, "to check the ear." She nodded once. He put his coat on and picked up the bag and the bread, and at the door he stopped and turned halfway back. "Warm water," he said. "Not hot. Every 4 hours." "Every 4 hours," she said. Then he was gone, and the door closed behind him, and the cold from outside came into the room briefly and settled and warmed again. Rebecca stood at the table with her hands still flat on the wood, and after a while she moved them and went to the stove and put the kettle on for the powders, and the shape of the evening began to arrange itself around what needed doing next. The boy's name was Samuel. He had been born the spring before his father died, and he had his father's brown hair and none of his father's height yet, and he was the whole of what she had. She sat by his bed through the night with the powders warm in a cup and woke him gently every 4 hours, and he took the water and slept again. And by the gray hour before dawn his forehead was cool under her palm, and he stirred and asked for bread the way the doctor had said he would. She laughed once. It came out of her before she could think about it, a small startled sound in the dark kitchen, and she pressed her hand over her mouth as though she had made a noise in church. Then she got up and cut a piece of the bread that was left and warmed a little milk and brought it to him, and he ate half of it and fell back asleep with the crust in his hand. Thursday came in cold and bright. She had risen early and had the bread already baking because a person did what a person did, and she was not going to be caught with an empty shelf when the doctor came. She had told herself this was practical. She had told herself it was because a doctor who came for bread should find bread, and she had not looked too closely at the fact that she had chosen the honey and oat loaves that took longer and cost more of what she had. He came at 10:30. He knocked the same single rap on the doorframe and came in and hung his coat on the peg, and Samuel, who had spent the morning on the rug by the stove with a wooden horse, looked up and said, "The doctor," in the pleased and certain voice of a child who has already decided a person is safe. Dr. Halloran crouched down by the rug and looked at the boy properly. He asked him about the horse. Samuel told him at length. The doctor listened as though he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be, which was not true, and Rebecca stood at the stove and watched this and made herself look away and stirred something that did not need stirring. When he had finished with Samuel and the ear and pronounced the boy sound, he came to the table and sat down without being asked, in the way of a man who was moving from the professional part of the visit to the part that was less clearly defined. She poured coffee without asking. He took it. "How long has it been," he said, "since your husband?" 16 months, he nodded. He did not say he was sorry, and she was grateful for that because she had heard sorry from enough people to know that the word wore out when it was used too often. He drank his coffee. He looked at the boy on the rug. "He looks like you," he said. "He looks like his father. He looks like both then." She almost smiled. She caught it before it happened and turned her face toward the stove, and it went away, but he had seen the beginning of it, and he looked back down at his cup and did not press the point. He was not a man who pressed points. She had noted this on Thursday, and she noted it again now, and she filed it away with the other small observations a woman makes when she is deciding what a man is. He stayed 40 minutes. When he stood to leave, she had 2 loaves wrapped and waiting on the table, and he picked them up the way he had the first time with both hands and thanked her plainly. At the door he stopped again. "The ear is fine," he said, "but children this age, sometimes it comes back. I'll come by next week, just to be sure." "That isn't necessary. I'd like to." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something in the room was being said without being said, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was ready to name it aloud. She nodded once. He touched the brim of his hat and went out into the cold, and she stood at the window and watched him walk down the frozen ruts of the road toward the town, the bread in one hand and the bag in the other, and she did not move from the window until he was out of sight. She turned back into the kitchen. Samuel was still on the rug with the horse. The fire was doing its quiet work in the stove. The loaves on the shelf sat cooling in their orderly row, and she looked at them and thought about how many she had baked in her life without counting, and how the counting had begun the day her husband died, and how it had continued every day since, and how this morning, for the first time in 16 months, she had baked without counting. She did not know what to do with that. She went to the flour bin and started the next batch. The following Thursday he came at 10:30 again, and the Thursday after that, and the Thursday after that. He examined Samuel each time and pronounced him well each time, and each time he stayed for coffee, and each time he left with 2 loaves wrapped in linen. Rebecca began to bake different breads on Wednesday evenings. She told herself this was because she had a standing customer now, and a standing customer deserved variety. She did not tell herself the other thing. The town began to notice by the fourth Thursday. Mrs. Larkin at the pharmacy noticed first because Dr. Halloran had begun to eat lunch at his desk on Thursdays, which he had never done before, and she worked out for herself what a man was doing when he ate lunch at his desk instead of at the boarding house where his lunch was already paid for. Mrs. Larkin was a person who noticed things and mostly kept them to herself, and she kept this one to herself as well, but she smiled a small private smile when the doctor came in on Friday morning smelling faintly of yeast and honey. Others were less generous. The widow Ainsley, who lived across from the churchyard and had made a study of other people's business as though it were a paying trade, noted the direction of the doctor's horse each Thursday morning and put it together with what she had already decided about Rebecca Wren, which was that a widow of 16 months who baked bread as good as hers was baking for a reason, and the reason was probably not honest. She said as much at the sewing circle on the second Wednesday of the month, in the tone of a woman delivering unpleasant news she took no pleasure in, which was untrue. She took considerable pleasure in it. The other women at the circle listened. Some of them looked at their hands. One of them, Ruth Calloway, who had been Rebecca's friend since before either of them was married, set her needle down carefully and looked at the widow Ainsley for a long moment and did not say anything at all. The silence did more work than an argument would have. Ruth walked to Rebecca's cabin the next morning with a jar of preserves as her excuse and the truth as her purpose. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and watched Samuel play on the rug, and she waited until Rebecca sat down across from her before she said what she had come to say. "The Ainsley woman is talking." Rebecca looked at her cup. She turned it a quarter turn on the wood, then another quarter, and set her hand flat beside it. "About the doctor. About the doctor. I thought she might be." Ruth waited. Rebecca did not go on. Ruth had known her a long time, and she knew that Rebecca would say what she needed to say when she was ready and not before, and so Ruth drank her coffee and looked at the boy on the rug and let the kitchen do its slow work of settling around them. "He comes on Thursdays," Rebecca said finally. "He checks the ear, he drinks coffee, he takes 2 loaves and he goes. That's all." "That's all," Ruth nodded. She believed it. She also believed that not all was not the same as nothing, and that Rebecca knew this too, and that the difference between the two things was where the trouble lived. "He's a good man," Ruth said. "I know he is. That's part of the difficulty." Rebecca looked up at her then, and there was something in her face that had not been there a moment before, something tired and honest, and Ruth saw it and reached across the table and put her hand over Rebecca's on the wood, and neither of them said anything for a while. Samuel on the rug made a small clopping noise with the wooden horse and did not look up. "He hasn't said anything," Rebecca said. "I don't imagine he has. He isn't the sort of man who would." "No," Ruth said. "He isn't." She left before noon. She did not tell Rebecca what to do. Ruth had been married 11 years and had learned in that time that telling another woman what to do was among the least useful things a friend could offer, and so she had offered instead the fact of her presence and the jar of preserves in her hand on the table, and she thought as she walked home that this was probably enough for now and possibly more than Rebecca had been given in a long time. Thursday came again. Dr. Halloran came at 10:30. He examined Samuel, who was by now completely well and who submitted to the examination with the patient tolerance of a small child humoring a familiar adult, and he pronounced the boy sound as he had pronounced him sound the 4 Thursdays before, and he sat at the table and Rebecca poured his coffee. She had decided, sometime during the week, that she would tell him what was being said. She had decided this in the pragmatic way she decided most things, which was by working out what would happen if she did not and finding the answer unacceptable. If the talk grew, and if he heard it from someone else, and if he then thought that she had known and had not told him, that would be a worse thing than the awkwardness of telling him now. So she would tell him now. She set his cup in front of him and sat down across from him, and she said it plainly. "The widow Ainsley is talking about your visits." He set his cup down without drinking from it. He looked at her steadily. What is she saying? What you would expect her to say. He nodded slowly. He looked at the cup and then at Samuel on the rug and then back at her. His face did not change in any obvious way, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, the way a man's shoulders shift when he has decided something. Would you like me to stop coming? The question was fair and clean, without any of the coaxing that a lesser man might have put around it. He was asking her what she wanted. He was making it her choice. Rebecca looked at him across the table and she thought about the 4 Thursdays and about the loaves and about the fact that Samuel had begun to watch the road on Thursday mornings. No, she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then he nodded once and picked up his cup and drank his coffee. Neither of them said anything else about it. When he stood to go, she wrapped his loaves and he took them, and at the door he stopped as he always did. Next Thursday, he said. Next Thursday, she said. He touched the brim of his hat and went out, and she stood at the window and watched him ride down the road, and this time she noticed that he was sitting a little straighter in the saddle than he had been when he arrived, and she did not know what to make of that, and she went back to her flour bin. The widow Ainsley did not stop. If anything, she took the doctor's continued visits as confirmation of what she had suspected, and she began to say so in places where more people would hear. She said it in the general store on a Saturday afternoon with a clear voice and a satisfied face, and she said it to the pastor's wife after Sunday service in the tone of a woman raising a spiritual concern. And by the second week of the new month, the talk had reached the doctor himself through 3 different channels, none of which he had solicited. He took it the way he took most things. He did not defend himself and he did not complain about being talked about, because complaining about being talked about was, in his experience, the surest way to get talked about more. He continued to go to Rebecca's cabin on Thursdays. He continued to take 2 loaves. He continued to drink his coffee at her table and to leave when he had drunk it, and he did not add anything to his visits that had not been there before, because he understood that adding anything now would be a kind of surrender to what was being said, and he was not going to surrender. But something else was happening, and both of them knew it, and the not nomming of it was becoming its own kind of weight. It came to a head on a Thursday in early March. The snow had begun to soften on the road, and the eaves of the cabin were dripping in the afternoon sun, and Samuel had been outside in the yard for the first time in weeks, watching the water drop from the roof line with the absorbed attention of a boy who has been kept indoors too long. Dr. Halloran came at 10:30. He examined Samuel briefly, more out of habit now than necessity, and he came to the table for his coffee. He did not sit down. He stood with his hand on the back of the chair and he looked at her for a long moment, and Rebecca, who was pouring the coffee, understood before he said anything that today was going to be different, and she set the pot down carefully and stood on the other side of the table and waited. "I have to say something," he said. "All right. I have been coming here on Thursdays for 2 months. Samuel has been well for 6 weeks. I am not coming as his doctor anymore, and I have not been for some time, and I think we both know that." She said nothing. "I do not want to make you uncomfortable in your own house. I do not want to be one more thing you have to manage. If you want me to stop coming, I will stop coming, and I will not think less of you for it, and I will not stop being your doctor if you need one. But I am not going to keep coming under a pretense, because you deserve better than a pretense, and so do I." He stopped. He waited. His hand was still on the back of the chair, and his knuckles were paler than they should have been, and Rebecca saw this and understood what it had cost him to say what he had just said. She looked at the table between them. She looked at the loaves on the shelf. She looked finally at his face, which was steady and honest and asking her nothing except the truth. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat. She folded her hands on the wood in front of her. "I have been baking honey and oat loaves on Wednesday evenings," she said, "for 2 months. He looked at her and his mouth moved once at the corner the way it did when he was holding something in. "I noticed," he said. "I thought you might have. I did not say anything." "No, you didn't." They sat with that for a moment. The kettle on the stove made its small sound. Outside, the water dropped from the eaves in its steady percussion, and Samuel could be heard in the yard talking to himself in the way of a 4-year-old who has a great deal to say and no particular audience for it. "I am not asking you for anything today," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am telling you where I stand because I would rather you know than not know. What happens next is yours to decide, and I will wait for as long as you need to decide it, and if the answer is no, I will accept it." She looked at him. She thought about her husband, who had been a good man and had died of a fever in 3 days without warning, and about the 16 months since, and about the shape of the life she had built inside those months, which was a small and careful shape and had kept her and Samuel alive. She thought about how a person builds a shape like that by making it small on purpose, because a small shape is easier to hold when your hands are shaking. She thought about Dr. Halloran, who had come the first Thursday and taken the bread without flinching, and who had come every Thursday since, and who was sitting across from her now with his knuckles pale on the back of a chair he was no longer touching, waiting for her to speak. "I need time," she said. "Take it. I don't know how much. Take what you need." She nodded. He drank his coffee. When he stood to go, she wrapped the loaves as she always did, and he took them as he always did, and at the door he stopped as he always did, and she thought that this was the same and not the same, and both of these things were true. "Next Thursday," he said. "Next Thursday," she said. He went out. She stood at the window and watched him ride down the road, and then she went to the yard and brought Samuel inside for his dinner, and she got through the rest of the day the way a person gets through a day when something large has been said and cannot be unsaid. That evening, after Samuel was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with a single candle and a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she thought. She thought for a long time. She thought about her husband, whose name had been John, and who had been buried in the churchyard under a stone she was still paying off at 40 cents a month. She thought about the wedding they had had, which had been small, and about the way he had looked at her across the table at supper for the 6 years they had been married, which had been steady and kind. She thought about how he would want her to answer this question, and she stopped herself, because she knew that using a dead man to answer a question about the living was a way of avoiding the question, and she was not going to do that. She thought about herself, about what she wanted, about whether she wanted anything at all, which was a question she had not permitted herself to ask in 16 months, because asking it had felt like a betrayal of the grief that was the only thing she had left of John. She sat with the question. She did not answer it that night. She banked the fire and went to bed and lay in the dark with her hand on the cold place beside her where John had once been, and she cried for the first time in a long while, and then she slept. In the morning she rose and made bread. She made it without thinking, which was the way she had made bread since she was 12. Her hands did the work. Her mind was somewhere else, and somewhere in the folding of the dough and the shaping of the loaves and the sliding of them into the oven, a small quiet thing settled in her chest, and she recognized it, and she did not push it away. The next Thursday she rose earlier than usual and made the honey and oat loaves and swept the front room twice, which she noticed she was doing and let herself do without commentary. Samuel came into the kitchen in his sock feet and asked whether the doctor was coming, and she said yes, and he nodded gravely, in the way of a small child confirming a fact of importance to his day, and he went to fetch the wooden horse from the rug and set it on the windowsill so that it too could watch the road. Dr. Halloran came at 10:30. She heard the horse before she saw it. She wiped her hands on her apron and untied it and hung it on the peg by the door, and then she thought better of that and put it back on, because taking off her apron for a caller was the sort of gesture she was not ready to make in front of herself, let alone in front of him. She opened the door before he knocked. He came in. He hung his coat. He looked at her and she looked at him, and he did not ask, and she was grateful that he did not ask, because being asked would have made it a smaller thing than it was. "Sit down," she said. "The coffee is ready." He sat. She poured. She sat down across from him, and she folded her hands on the table in front of her the way she had folded them the week before, and she looked at him steadily. "I have thought about what you said. Yes. I want to say some things before I say the rest. Go on. I was married for 6 years. My husband's name was John Wren. He was a good man and I loved him and I will not stop loving him. And I want you to know that before anything else is said, because if that is a problem for you, then we should not go further. It is not a problem for me. You have not thought about it. I have thought about it. I thought about it before I said what I said last week. A woman who could stop loving a good man because he died is not the woman I would want to sit across a table from. I am not asking you to stop. I am asking whether there is room. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at her hands. She looked at him again. There is room, she said. He did not smile. He did not reach across the table. He nodded once slowly, and he let out a breath she had not realized he had been holding, and he said quietly, "Thank you. I am not saying yes to anything yet," she said. "I am saying there is room. I understand. I am saying you can keep coming on Thursdays and we can see what this is, and I am not going to hurry it, and I am not going to let anyone else hurry it either. That is what I want too. And I am going to keep giving you bread." Good. The corner of his mouth moved then, and hers moved too, and for a moment they both almost smiled at each other across the table. And then they both looked down at their cups because looking at each other was too much for that particular Thursday, and there would be other Thursdays. Samuel came in from the rug and stood at the table between them and put the wooden horse down on the wood with great deliberation and looked up at the doctor. "His name is Buckwheat," he said. "That is a fine name for a horse. He is a good horse. He does not bite. A useful quality." Samuel considered this and nodded and picked the horse back up and went out. Dr. Halloran watched him go and then looked back at Rebecca, and she saw in his face something she had not seen there before, which was the look of a man who was allowing himself to picture a future, and she felt her chest tighten around the thing she had recognized in the bread that morning, and she looked down at her cup. He stayed his usual 40 minutes. When he left, she wrapped his loaves as she always did. At the door he stopped. "Next Thursday," he said. "Next Thursday," she said. The widow Ainsley did not know that anything had changed because nothing had changed in a way that could be seen from the outside. The doctor still came on Thursdays. He still stayed 40 minutes. He still left with 2 loaves, but something inside the visits had shifted and the two of them knew it, and it was enough for now that the two of them knew it. March gave over to April. The road thawed and became a river of mud and then began to dry, and the first green came up along the fence line, and Samuel found a nest of new kittens in the barn behind Mrs. Larkin's pharmacy, and negotiated for one with the seriousness of a man buying land. Rebecca let him have it. The kitten was gray and had one white paw, and Samuel named it Biscuit, which Dr. Halloran, when he heard it the following Thursday, pronounced a sound name and consistent with the household. They walked out one Sunday afternoon in the middle of April. It was the first walking out they had done, and they did it with Samuel between them, and they went along the road toward the creek and back, and they did not touch each other and they did not say very much, but they walked at the same pace, and when Samuel got tired, Dr. Halloran picked him up and carried him on his shoulders without asking, and Rebecca watched this and did not say anything about it. And something in her chest that had been braced for 16 months let go a little further. They were seen. Of course they were seen. The road past the creek was not a private road, and by Monday morning the town knew that Dr. Halloran had been walking out with the widow Wren, and by Monday afternoon the widow Ainsley had a fresh subject for the sewing circle, which she raised with the same reluctant tone she used for all her favorite subjects. Ruth Calloway, who was again at the circle, set her needle down again and looked at the widow Ainsley again, and this time she spoke. "Vera," she said, using the widow Ainsley's given name in the tone of a woman who had known her since they were both 8, "if you have something useful to say about Rebecca Wren, I would like to hear it. If you do not, I would like you to stop." The sewing circle went very quiet. The widow Ainsley opened her mouth and closed it again. Ruth picked up her needle and resumed her stitching without looking up. The pastor's wife, who had been about to agree with the widow Ainsley, changed her mind and asked about the pattern Ruth was working, and the circle moved on, and the widow Ainsley sat with her mouth in a thin line for the rest of the afternoon and did not raise the subject again. By the following Sunday, When Rebecca and Dr. Halloran and Samuel walked out again, one or two people on the road nodded to them as they passed, and no one turned to whisper afterward, and a small piece of the town's business had quietly rearranged itself, as small pieces of a town's business sometimes do. May came in warm and steady. The garden went in. Dr. Halloran arrived one Thursday with a bundle of seedlings from the boarding house's own garden, which the boarding house missus had given him with a knowing look he had pretended not to see, and he set them on Rebecca's kitchen table without comment. She looked at the seedlings and at him and shook her head once, but she was smiling by then, and she went out to the plot behind the cabin with him and Samuel, and they got the seedlings into the ground before the afternoon rain came. That was the day he first held her hand. It was after the seedlings were in and Samuel had run into the cabin ahead of the rain, and they were standing at the edge of the garden with the sky darkening and the wind coming up warm off the fields, and he reached across the small space between them and took her hand in his. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. His hand was warm and slightly damp from the soil, and hers was the same, and they stood there for the length of a slow breath before the rain started and they went in. Inside, Samuel was already at the window, watching the rain fall. He asked her to marry him in the last week of June, on a Thursday, at her kitchen table, in the plain way he did most things. He had brought no ring because he had not wanted to presume, and he said so, and he said that if her answer was yes, he would like her to come with him to the jeweler in the county seat the following Saturday and choose one that suited her, because he had noticed that she had strong opinions about the things she wore on her hands, which was true, and which she had not known that he had noticed. She said yes. She said it quietly and without any fuss, because a fuss was not what the moment called for. He nodded once, and he took her hand across the table, and he held it for a long moment, and then he let it go and picked up his coffee, and they sat with what had just happened while the coffee cooled, and Samuel on the rug played with Biscuit the kitten, and did not know yet that his life had just changed. They told Samuel that evening. Dr. Halloran stayed for supper, which he had not done before, and after Samuel had eaten his beans and his bread and had been allowed a small portion of the pie Rebecca had made for the occasion, they sat him down and told him. Samuel considered this news in the grave way he considered all news, and he looked at Dr. Halloran and then at his mother and then at Dr. Halloran again. "Will you live here?" "I will." "With us?" "With you." Samuel thought about this some more. He looked at Biscuit, who was asleep on the rug with her white paw over her nose. He looked at the wooden horse on the windowsill. He looked at his mother, and he saw whatever it was he saw in her face, and he seemed satisfied by it. "All right," he said. Then he asked whether Dr. Halloran had a horse of his own, or whether he would need to share buckwheat, and Dr. Halloran said gravely that he had a horse of his own, and would not need to share, and Samuel nodded and returned to his pie. They were married in the middle of August in the small white church at the end of the town, on a Saturday morning with the doors open to catch the breeze. Rebecca wore a dress that Ruth Calloway had helped her make, of a pale blue linen that Ruth had said suited her, and she carried nothing in her hands because her hands were busy holding Samuel's on one side and Dr. Halloran's on the other for the walk down the aisle, which was how she had wanted it and how he had wanted it too. The pastor said the words. They said the words back. The widow Ainsley sat in the third pew from the back with her mouth in its thin line and said nothing, because there was nothing left for her to say. And by the time the service was over she had decided, in the practical way of a woman who has lost a favorite subject, to be gracious about it in public, and to find something new to be aggrieved about at home. There was a small dinner afterward at the boarding house, because Rebecca's cabin was not big enough for the number of people who wanted to come, and Rebecca had been surprised at how many people wanted to come. She had thought of herself for so long as a woman living quietly at the edge of the town that she had forgotten that the town had been watching her all along, and that a great many of them had been rooting for her without her knowing it. Mrs. Larkin from the pharmacy came, and Ruth and her husband and their 4 children, and the pastor and his wife, and the man from the general store and his wife, and half a dozen others besides. They ate and they drank and they toasted the couple with the plain and heartfelt words of a town that had decided a good thing had happened. Dr. Halloran, whose given name was Thomas and who had been Thomas to Rebecca for a month by then, sat beside his wife at the long table and held her hand under the cloth. He did not say very much. He did not need to. His face said what needed saying, and Rebecca, glancing at him, saw it and felt the last of the 16 months finally let go of her. They went home to the cabin that evening, the three of them, and Samuel fell asleep in the wagon on the way and had to be carried in, and Thomas carried him without a word and laid him in his bed and pulled the quilt up to his chin. Biscuit the kitten, who had grown considerably in 2 months and was now more cat than kitten, climbed onto the foot of the bed and settled there in the proprietary way of a creature who had decided a household was hers. Thomas stood for a moment looking down at the sleeping boy, and then he came out to the kitchen where Rebecca was banking the fire for the night. She turned when she heard him. He crossed the room and took her hands, and they stood at the stove with the low red light on their faces, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying that had not already been said in the church that morning. After a moment she reached up and touched his cheek with the back of her hand. He closed his eyes briefly, then he opened them and looked at her. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the first Thursday. I have too. You said you could only pay me in bread. I remember. I want you to know something. That was not why I came back. I know. But it was not why I came back either. There was something in the way you said it. You did not apologize. You did not lower your eyes. You told me the truth about what you had, and you did not make yourself smaller in order to say it. I had not seen a person do that in a long time." She looked at him. She did not say anything because her throat had closed up in the way it sometimes did when a person heard something true said about them out loud. "I came back the second time because I wanted to," he said, "and every time after." "I know," she said. "I have known for a while." So had I. They stood there a little longer. Then she banked the last of the fire and they went to bed, and the cabin held its quiet around them, and outside the summer night moved slowly past the windows, and somewhere in the yard an owl called once and was quiet. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because no years are, but they were good years. Samuel grew tall in the way of a boy whose father had been tall, and he learned to read at the kitchen table with Thomas beside him, and he learned to bake beside his mother. And by the time he was 10, he could turn out a loaf of honey and oat bread that was almost as good as hers, which she told him was the highest compliment she was prepared to give. 2 more children came, a girl first and then a boy, both healthy, both delivered by the midwife, because Thomas said he was not fool enough to try to deliver his own children when there was a competent woman 2 miles down the road who could do it better. The girl was named Anne after Rebecca's mother, and the boy was named John after her first husband, and Thomas had suggested the name himself because he was that kind of man, and Rebecca had cried when he suggested it and had said yes. The cabin grew. Thomas added a room to the back, and then another, and eventually a proper front porch with a rocking chair on it, and Rebecca sat on that porch in the evenings when the children were asleep, and looked at the road she had once watched him ride down and thought about how a life could turn on a single Thursday morning, and a single true sentence spoken across a kitchen table. The bread never stopped. She baked it every day of her life until she was too old to lift the flour bin, and then she taught her daughter, and her daughter taught her own daughters, and the honey and oat loaves became a small famous thing in that county. And if you asked any of the women in that family why they baked what they baked, they would tell you the story of a widow and a doctor and a Thursday in winter, and they would tell it well. And that was the story of Rebecca, a woman who had nothing but flour and a spine, and paid what she owed in bread, and found she had been paying all along for something worth every loaf.